Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I wanted to take a few minutes this evening to kind of go over my Sunday school lesson this morning with you guys who may not have been there, or for anybody else who just wants to kind of go through a little bit of scripture tonight. We're doing a special Sunday school summer series with my Sunday school class and Drew Calhoun's Sunday school class. We've kind of combined classes and we're taking turns teaching through these major events of the Old Testament to try to give people some insight into the order these events occurred in and just a little more knowledge and understanding about what these events were, how they fit into the narrative of the Old Testament as a whole, and really how they tend to move the narrative along toward the New Testament. We're doing an 8-week series on it. This is the second week. We started with Noah and the Ark, which Drew taught last week while I was out of town. And then today was my day, my first day to teach, and I was teaching on the Exodus from Egypt, which when I was preparing for this, just looking over kind of the resources that are available, most people take the Exodus from Egypt and they break it down into like a 12-week study or so, where I had about 35 minutes to cram all this into a Sunday school lesson this morning. So I do want to give a caveat and a disclaimer. This is in no way a comprehensive study of Exodus. This is going to give you a little bit of insight leading up into the Exodus, why the Israelites were in Egypt, what brought them there, all that kind of stuff. We're going to look specifically at the parting of the Red Sea, and then we're going to look at some stuff that happened as they progressed through the Exodus toward the Promised Land. But again, most people break this down into 3 months or so worth of information, and we're going to try to knock it all out in about 25 to 30 minutes here on this, because I know that you're probably not going to watch it if it's any longer than that. So we're going to jump into it. And up here in the corner right here, I'm going to have the worksheet that I designed for the class. I'm going to be filling it out as we go, so feel free to take a look at that. It should be right up here in the corner. I think I can figure out how to do that before I upload this. But we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, what led to the Israelites being slaves in Egypt really happened about 400 years or so before the story opens up with Moses. What we're looking at is way back when Joseph in the Coat of Many Colors. I'm sure we've all remembered that story from the Bible. Joseph was sold into slavery, went into Egypt. He was a slave in Potiphar's house. Potiphar threw him in prison. He interpreted some dreams for someone in prison who was close to the Pharaoh. They said they were going to remember Joseph when they got out of prison. And ultimately they did remember him when Pharaoh had some dreams that needed to be interpreted. So Joseph went from the pit, the prison, to a position of prominence in Egypt. When there was a famine in the land, he was in charge of all of the grain stores and all of the food stores for the entire nation of Egypt. He made sure that they had enough to get through the lean times. And during this time, his family traveled into Egypt to try to barter for grain. Egypt was the only nation around at the time who had grain, and his family needed grain to survive, so they went to Egypt to try to purchase and barter for grain. Now, while they were there, Joseph recognized his brothers. A lot of things happened. Ultimately, his whole family moves to Egypt with him, with Pharaoh's blessing. So his whole family moves into Egypt with him. He and his 11 other brothers, there are 12 of them. Coincidentally, there are also 12 tribes of Israel, which these 12 brothers will be the heads of. So over a 400-year period, roughly 400-year period, we have Joseph's family doing what families do, getting bigger and broader and bigger. And over the 400-year period, they go from a family to a nation of 12 tribes, like a large gathering of people. And over the course of this 400 years, as they multiplied, as more of them got to be there in Egypt, the Egyptians noticed that there were more and more and more of them. So they said, hey, they're going to end up taking us over if we don't do something about it. So they subjugated them into slavery. And they used them for building, for agriculture. They were slaves in their homes. They used them for every form of slavery that you could imagine. So Moses was born into slavery in Egypt. There was an edict that went out at the time that said all the male children who were below a certain age had to be killed. Moses' mother did not want him to be killed, so she hid him for as long as she could, and then she placed him in a basket in the Nile River, and he was found by Pharaoh's daughter, who coincidentally needed a wet nurse and got Moses' actual mom to help raise him. So Moses was born a slave in Egypt. Through circumstance, he was instituted into the royal family, where he grew up in a position of prominence and enjoyed things that other Israelites did not enjoy at the time. So he is out and about in Egypt one day. He sees an Egyptian taskmaster abusing a Israelite slave, so he kills the taskmaster and he flees Egypt. After he flees Egypt, he becomes a shepherd, taking care of some flocks out in the wilderness, and this is where our story picks up. Israel had been in slavery for roughly 400 years at this point, and Moses is out in the wilderness. God wants the nation of Israel to be redeemed from their position of slavery, so he speaks to Moses through a burning bush. He speaks to Moses through a burning bush. So God tells Moses that he wants him to go to Israel and to go to Egypt, and to liberate the Israeli people, the whole nation of Israel. He wants to liberate them from their oppression in Egypt, and he wants to take them to the promised land, the same promised land that had been promised to Abraham and all his descendants way back in the beginning, right? So this is the land of Canaan, the land where the nation of Israel is ultimately going to settle, because it's the land that was given to them by God. And God wants to take the people out of Egypt and get them back to the place where he has ordained for them to be. So he tells Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let his people go. And Pharaoh is very resistant to this, which is understandable, because he is using the nation of Israel for that labor force, and Pharaoh does not want to lose his free labor. They use the nation of Israel for all types of things. They use them for agriculture, for farming, for stonework, for building structures. Excuse me. They utilize them for all sorts of things. So the Pharaoh does not want to lose his free labor source. So Moses, as convincing as he probably was not able to convince Pharaoh just on the words that he said to let the nation of Israel go. So God steps in, and what does God do? What does God put into place in order to make Pharaoh let the people go? That's right, it was plagues. And God brought 10 plagues against Egypt over a period of time. Each plague does get a little more substantial than the last. There are 10 plagues in total. We have the water turning into blood. And that's the water from the Nile. That's water that they had in cisterns. That's water that they had in pitchers. All the water turned to blood. Then we have the plague of frogs. There were frogs everywhere. Way more frogs than should have been naturally possible. Then we have the lice, flies, disease for livestock. After the disease for livestock, we have locusts. Then there is, I've got to look at my cheat sheet. Then there is hail and fire and boils. The hail and fire came down from the sky. It would have been a very, very traumatic event, I would assume. And then the boils are pretty much self-explanatory. They're these, festering sores that appear all over the body, and the entire nation of Egypt was afflicted by it. They had painful, nasty sores all over their body as one of the plagues visited on Egypt. And then last, we have darkness that fell over Egypt, and the very last thing was the death of the firstborn Egyptian babies. You have to forgive me, I'm filling in the worksheet as we go here. So now the death of the firstborn, this is where we get the Passover from. If you'll remember, God instructed the nation of Israel to cover their doorpost in blood so that the angel from the Lord would pass over those houses. And it's because they did this that none of their children were killed, but they still celebrate that Passover feast all throughout the Bible from this time forward. Even now they celebrate the Feast of Passover, and they celebrate that as a remembrance of what the Lord did when he was taking them out of Egypt. So the plagues do what their intended purpose is. They convince Pharaoh to let the people go. So the Israelite people, they get gold and silver from all the Egyptians. They get clothing from all the Egyptians, and they take off on the Exodus. And they're being led by Moses, who in turn is being led by God. And there are two different ways that they can go from Egypt to the Promised Land. They can go one way, which is a shorter path, and it crosses through a land that belongs to the ancestors of the Philistines, and they were a very warring people. So if they went that way, they would have had to fight for every inch that they went through that territory. I think God understood that if he took them out of a position of relative safety, although it was hardship in Egypt, and put them into a position where they had to fight tooth and nail for everything that they were doing, I think a lot of them would have turned and went back to their Egyptian captors at that point. The way that God did end up taking them through the desert actually ended up being one of those things that God must have planned out in his infinite wisdom, because it shows us a lot of different things. We're going to get into it here in just a minute. But one path goes through Philistine, or the ancient Philistine controlled territories, which would have been a hard fought battle. God decides to take them through the desert, which is hard in its own right, but it doesn't have the impending threat of war. Because at this stage in the nation of Israel's history, they are not prepared for a large scale battle. So they go to the Red Sea. Here is where we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of what we're looking at. Now, specifically, we're looking at chapter 14. I'm going to put chapter 14 up on the screen. You can pause this to read it. I'm not going to read through the entire chapter for you. It's 31 verses, though. I recommend that you did pause. Take the time to read it just so you have clear insight into what we're looking at. But God has led the Israelites through the desert to the edge of the Red Sea, as during the day is a pillar of cloud, at night is a pillar of fire. So they know that God is with them and that God is leading them, and that they are not just walking around all willy-nilly. They know that God is moving them in the direction that he wants them to go. So read chapter 14 now. Pause this. I'm going to give you just a couple of seconds to read it. And then we will jump back into the study. I can only assume that you paused the video and you read chapter 14. Now, there are a couple of things that we need to look at here. Number one, God told Moses as they approached the Red Sea that they needed to camp and wait, right? They needed to stop what they were doing. They needed to camp, and they were waiting on God to tell them what their next move was. Now, why did God tell Moses to stop and let the people see the Egyptian army coming after them? Because when they stopped, the Egyptian army is just coming out of Egypt trying to catch up to them. So the longer they're stopped, the more time they give the Egyptian army to catch up. And they start to see the army coming from a long way off. The people of Israel see the Egyptian army coming toward them. And they had just left out of Egypt. They understood how what hard masters the Egyptians were, and they were probably pretty terrified at the thought of the Egyptian army catching up to them. They thought that they were going to die in the desert. They thought that they were kind of done for at this point, because they saw the Egyptians coming toward them, and there was nowhere for them to go. They were between a rock and a hard place. They had the Red Sea on one side. They had the Egyptian army advancing on the other. They're in a position that seems hopeless. So why did God tell Moses to stop and let the people find themselves in that hopeless position? Because it's a situation that only God can get them out of. At this stage in the nation of Israel's history, there's been a 400-ish year period where they have not heard from God in a substantial way. God has been kind of silent as they have lived their life in Egypt. And it wasn't God being silent for any reason, for anything that the people of Israel did at this point. I really think he was just preparing them for their journey into the promised land. While they were there in Egypt, they were kind of insulated from the rest of the world. It gave them the ability to grow as a nation. But at this point, God needs them to realize who he is, who the God is that they serve, who the God is that is leading them out of captivity. God needs them to understand his nature, everything about him, and this is a perfect opportunity for him to demonstrate that in a way that they can see, in a way that's tangible. So why did God tell Moses to stop and let the people see the Egyptian army coming after them? Because it puts them in a position where God's power is the only thing that is going to be able to save them. And I'm not going to write that all out on the worksheet. I'm just going to kind of talk through that part. But yeah, this puts them in a situation where they're able to see God's power manifest on earth, and it prepares them for the things that are coming down the line. Why was it important to the people to see of Israel to see God move in such a dramatic manner? There are many, many ways that God could move in this situation, but in this situation, he chose to move by, number one, parting a body of water. Not only parting a body of water, but in the manner that it was parted, causing the land that it was parted from to be completely dry, which in and of itself is a miracle. It is a mighty move of God on earth. But then he takes it a step further, and this murderous nation that is coming to subjugate his people back into slavery, he wipes out their entire army. The Israelites see this army wiped out. They see the dead Egyptians wash up on the shore. They see all of this stuff happen. It is very, very dramatic. And the reason that God does that is because in the journey that is coming, in the journey that they are about to embark on, that's going to take them through the desert to the promised land, there are going to be many, many things that God instructs them to do, and that God lays out for them to follow through with. And they need to understand who it is that they're dealing with. They need to understand that this is the sovereign God of all creation, that he follows through with the things that he says, that he is all powerful, all knowing. He is able to accomplish what he sets out to accomplish. They need to be reacquainted with who God is on a fundamental level, and this is the way that God chooses to do that. He reintroduces himself to the nation of Israel in such a way that they are unable to not comprehend who he is, right? So while crossing the Red Sea is a very substantial event in the narrative of the Exodus, it's just the beginning, right? The Israel's journey is going to take a long time going through the wilderness. How does this one miraculous act prepare the nation for that? It shows them God's power. It shows them God's majesty. It shows them that God, above everything else, deserves glory and praise. It prepares them for the times in the wilderness when God instructs them to do something. It shows them that they need to do that, right? It prepares them because it shows them that the sovereign God of all creation is the one who is ordaining this journey to the promised land, and as such, they need to be committed to it. God is going to see them through. That part is for certain. There's nothing else that they can be more certain about. God is going to see them through. But at this point, it's been 400 years since they've had a substantial interaction with God. So God reintroduces himself to the nation of Israel and reacquaints himself to the nation of Israel in such a way that it is unmistakable who he is and what he's able to accomplish. So, after they part the Red Sea, they go into the desert. They start traveling toward the promised land. This is where we start to see the nation of Israel's cycle that they go through of obedience, disobedience, correction, redemption, obedience, disobedience, correction, redemption. It's kind of the overarching narrative of the entire Old Testament. The nation of Israel obeys God. Something happens. They choose not to obey God. They're disobedient. God uses something to bring correction to them. More often than not, it's an outside nation that God uses to bring correction to the nation of Israel. And then God redeems and reconciles his people to him. And we see that cycle happen over and over and over and over in the Old Testament. And that's where we get our sacrificial system. That's where we get all of this stuff that ultimately points to Jesus in the New Testament. Through this happening, after they got the 10 Commandments, they had the law, they had what was supposed to make it where they could live in the way that God wanted them to. But really, the law just points out our need for a Savior. Nobody can follow the law. That's what the law demonstrates, that nobody can live good enough to follow the law. So while they're in the wilderness, and they end up being in the wilderness for 40 years because of some of their disobedience, while they're in the wilderness, God takes care of them in spite of that cycle that we see, the obedience, disobedience, correction, and redemption. God continues to take care of them regardless of what's going on. So, what does that mean to us? Right? That's what we really want to get down to. Okay, so now what? Much like the ancient Israelites, God is guiding us toward a destination as well. Our destination is heaven, right? We're continually moving forward towards this goal. How does seeing God take care of his people historically influence how we move forward today? We see God's track record, right? We see how God has taken care of his people through history. We see that when God makes promises, he is true to keep those promises. We see that when things are prophesied that God will do, that God does those things. God has a 100% track record. He's batting 1,000. He has never said something and it not come to pass. So today, through the new covenant that we're under because of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, we can be confident that God is going to do the things that he has promised us that he is going to do, because we can look at that track record and we can see that he takes care of his people. And we know that going forward, we are his people under this new covenant, and he is going to take care of us too. We know that he is going to be faithful to do the things that he has said he's going to do. We can be assured in our salvation because he has decreed it through Christ's death on the cross. We can be sure that heaven is real and that Jesus has gone to prepare a place for us there because God keeps his promises. That kind of gets us to the end, guys. And again, believe me when I say this, that this is not a comprehensive look at Exodus. I would really encourage you guys to read the entire book of Exodus as a whole. It really gives a lot of insight into the nation of Israel and how God's plan for the redemption of that nation started. But thank you for checking this out, and I would love it if you would like and subscribe. It definitely helps out a small channel like mine. But thank you, and you guys have a great day.